beam from the Japanese destroyer's searchlight slid across the sea, cutting through the darkness like a blade. For a brief moment it seemed certain that it would find us. Instead, it passed just ahead of our bow and continued into the night. No one aboard PT-164 moved. 23 American sailors remained frozen in place, engines barely turning, allowing the small wooden boat to drift silently off the coast of Vella La Vella. Beyond that destroyer sailed 3 enemy transports carrying thousands of troops. The men aboard had no idea that within minutes their voyage through the Solomon Islands would be interrupted by a surprise attack emerging from the darkness around them. It was July 19, 1943. The humid tropical air hung heavy over the water. My palms were damp as I gripped the twin .50 caliber mount. Every sound seemed amplified. Every shadow looked dangerous. Nearby, Ensign Robert Dutch Vandenberg quietly relayed navigation information to our commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Arthur McPherson. The faint green glow of our compass was the only visible light aboard the boat. A short distance away, concealed by the island's dark silhouette, 2 other PT boats waited in position. Together we formed a small striking force that depended on speed, coordination, and surprise rather than size or armor. The Japanese Navy had spent years mastering combat operations after sunset. That night, they were about to discover that the balance was beginning to change. My name is Chief Petty Officer Thomas Harrigan of the United States Navy Reserve. Looking back now, people often ask what it felt like to serve aboard one of the Navy's most unusual vessels during the war. The honest answer is simple. We rarely thought about history. We thought about survival. We focused on the next mission, the next patrol, and the next sunrise. What mattered most was preventing enemy reinforcements from reaching key battlefields. Every successful interception reduced pressure on Allied forces fighting across the islands. Every mission carried the possibility of saving lives far beyond our own crew. To understand why these operations mattered, you have to remember the situation in the Pacific during 1943. Night belonged to the Japanese. Their sailors had developed an impressive reputation for operating in darkness. Through training, discipline, and experience, they became highly effective at moving troops and supplies after sunset. Their supply missions became famous throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. Allied forces watched these nighttime movements with growing concern because they allowed reinforcements to reach contested areas with remarkable speed. Traditional naval tactics often struggled against such operations. Large warships possessed tremendous firepower, but confined island waters created challenges that many commanders had never anticipated. The United States needed a new approach. Rather than relying solely on large cruisers and destroyers, naval planners began experimenting with fast, agile craft capable of operating where larger vessels faced limitations. That solution arrived in the form of the Patrol Torpedo Boat, better known as the PT boat. Built primarily from layers of carefully crafted mahogany, these vessels looked more like racing boats than warships. Measuring roughly 80 feet in length, they were compact, lightweight, and remarkably fast. Powered by 3 powerful Packard engines derived from aviation technology, they could achieve speeds that surprised friend and foe alike. Their appearance often caused skepticism among experienced sailors. Wooden construction seemed out of place in a war dominated by steel warships. Yet those same qualities gave PT boats unique advantages. They could move quickly, operate in shallow waters, and appear unexpectedly where larger ships could not. What began as an unconventional experiment soon became an important part of naval operations in the Pacific. Small crews, operating under cover of darkness, proved that innovation and determination could challenge far larger forces. In the waters of the Solomon Islands, these boats helped reshape the struggle for control of the night. Our boat carried 4 torpedoes, several heavy machine guns, a light deck cannon, and enough ammunition to support a short but intense engagement. The reality was simple. We were built for quick strikes, not prolonged battles. If a fight lasted too long, something had already gone wrong. My introduction to the PT boat program came in February of 1943 at the Motor Torpedo Boat Training Center in Melville, Rhode Island. Before that, I had served aboard a destroyer, escorting convoys across the North Atlantic. Life there was cold, exhausting, and predictable. Then one day, the Navy requested volunteers for a new assignment involving experimental vessels and unusually dangerous missions. Details were scarce. The officers conducting the interviews shared very little, except that the work would involve significant risk. Hundreds applied. Only a small group was selected. I suspect my background helped. Growing up along Chesapeake Bay had given me experience with small craft, and years at sea had taught me celestial navigation. Whatever the reason, my name ended up on the final list. The first time I saw PT-164 tied to the dock, I honestly wondered if someone was playing a joke on us. Compared to the destroyers I knew, the boat seemed impossibly small. The hull was built primarily of wood. In a war dominated by steel ships, armor plating, and massive guns, it looked completely out of place. Living space was almost non-existent. Every inch of room served a purpose, and privacy simply did not exist. Protection was minimal. We relied far more on speed and maneuverability than on armor. The idea of taking direct fire from a larger warship was enough to make any sensible sailor nervous. Then I met our skipper. Lieutenant Commander Arthur McPherson was 28 years old, which made him one of the older officers in the squadron. He carried himself with quiet confidence and possessed the calm expression of someone who had already experienced more combat than most men twice his age. He had witnessed the opening months of the Pacific War firsthand and had served through some of its most demanding campaigns. Rather than remaining aboard larger ships, he had chosen the PT service because he believed the future belonged to speed, surprise, and initiative. His philosophy was straightforward. Large warships dominated open oceans. PT boats thrived in places where larger vessels struggled. We would not win by matching an opponent's size or firepower. We would succeed by appearing unexpectedly, striking quickly, and disappearing before a response could be organized. Once I understood that, the boat began to make sense. Our crew reflected that same unconventional spirit. Executive Officer Robert Vanderberg had been a university mathematics instructor before entering military service. He possessed an extraordinary ability to process numbers and distances under pressure. Many of us joked that his mind worked faster than any calculating machine we had ever seen. Chief Motor Machinist Carlos Mendoza came from the world of high-performance engines. He understood our 3 Packard power plants better than anyone. When those engines were running perfectly, he could identify the slightest mechanical issue simply by listening. Radio operator William Patterson had previously served with undersea forces and brought a level of discipline and patience that proved invaluable during nighttime operations. He could sit motionless for hours, listening through static for the faintest signal. The man responsible for our torpedoes was gunner's mate Patrick O'Brien. He treated every weapon aboard as if it were a priceless work of art. Long after the rest of us had finished our duties, he could usually be found inspecting equipment, making adjustments, and ensuring everything was ready for the next mission. The remainder of the crew came from every corner of America. Some had grown up in large cities. Others came from farms, fishing towns, or small communities scattered across the country. Our backgrounds differed, but we shared one important trait. Every man aboard had volunteered. No one had forced us into this assignment. We knew the risks before we arrived. Training at Melville reinforced that reality every day. The instructors demanded precision, endurance, and adaptability. We spent countless hours practicing high-speed maneuvering in rough water. We trained to operate in darkness, poor weather, and confusing conditions where mistakes could become fatal. Navigation exercises pushed us to rely on instinct and experience as much as instruments. Crews learned to recognize coastlines, currents, engine sounds, and weather patterns. We were expected to function effectively even when visibility disappeared and communications became unreliable. More than anything else, the instructors taught us to abandon traditional assumptions about naval warfare. Commander James Patterson, who oversaw much of the program, often reminded us that PT boats represented a completely different way of fighting at sea. According to him, success depended on imagination, flexibility, and timing. A PT crew could not think like the crews of battleships or cruisers. We had to think like hunters moving through unfamiliar waters, constantly searching for opportunities while avoiding unnecessary risks. By the time training ended, we no longer saw ourselves as sailors assigned to small boats. We saw ourselves as members of a new kind of naval force, one designed specifically for the dangerous nighttime waters of the Pacific. Soon enough, the Solomon Islands would put every lesson we had learned to the test. Commander Patterson often repeated a lesson that stayed with us long after training ended. The enemy would expect predictable behavior. They would expect familiar tactics and established patterns. Our advantage came from doing the unexpected. If they felt comfortable operating after sunset, then our job was to make the darkness work against them. According to him, speed mattered, surprise mattered, confidence mattered. More than any weapon mounted on our deck, those qualities would determine whether we returned safely from a mission. We reached our forward operating base on Rendova Island at the end of June 1943, just as Allied forces were beginning major operations against Japanese positions in New Georgia. Calling it a naval base was generous. The facility consisted of fuel storage areas, a handful of camouflaged structures, and a rough dock concealed beneath dense tropical vegetation. Everything was temporary, improvised, and built with practicality in mind. The first thing most newcomers noticed was the smell. The jungle carried a mixture of damp earth, decaying vegetation, fuel, salt water, and tropical humidity. The second thing was the distant sound of combat. Across the water, artillery echoed day and night as American forces fought to secure the strategically important airfield at Munda. Our squadron operated 12 PT boats throughout the central Solomon Islands. On paper, our assignment seemed straightforward. Monitor key waterways, locate enemy maritime traffic, and prevent reinforcements from reaching contested areas. The reality proved far more challenging. The Solomons were a navigator's nightmare. Coral reefs lurked beneath the surface. Volcanic islands created confusing silhouettes after sunset. Narrow channels twisted between coastlines, and hidden positions could turn any patrol into a dangerous encounter. The Japanese understood the region well. They maintained observation networks across numerous islands and possessed aircraft capable of monitoring large stretches of water. Their naval forces had extensive experience operating in these conditions. Our first significant patrol demonstrated just how difficult the mission would be. Early in July, several PT boats attempted to intercept enemy shipping movements near one of the island passages. Before we could maneuver into a favorable position, our presence was detected. Within a short time, larger enemy vessels were moving toward the area, illuminating the darkness with powerful searchlights. The situation deteriorated quickly. Our boats scattered in different directions, weaving through reefs and narrow passages while trying to avoid detection. The darkness that usually protected us suddenly felt much smaller. Hours later, the surviving crews finally regrouped. The mission had accomplished nothing. No targets had been reached. No meaningful results had been achieved. Worse still, we had suffered losses that reminded everyone how dangerous these waters could be. That evening, back at Rendova, Lieutenant Commander McPherson gathered the crews together. He spoke calmly, without anger or blame. What mattered, he explained, was understanding why the mission had failed. We had approached the situation as though we were operating larger warships. PT boats were not designed for prolonged confrontations or direct exchanges with heavily armed opponents. Our strengths lay elsewhere. If we could not achieve surprise, we needed to disengage and look for another opportunity. The lesson was difficult, but it transformed the way we operated. Over the following weeks, crews throughout the squadron refined their methods through experience. Every patrol taught us something new about the islands, the weather, and the enemy. We learned how terrain affected visibility and movement. We studied ways to reduce our profile while approaching an objective. Crews developed simple communication techniques that allowed coordination without broadcasting signals over the radio. Gradually, operations became more efficient. An important part of that success came from the remarkable network of people supporting Allied efforts throughout the region. Observers stationed on remote islands reported ship movements whenever possible. Local residents familiar with every coastline, channel, and inlet shared valuable information about activity in nearby waters. Intelligence officers assembled reports from numerous sources, creating a clearer picture of enemy movements throughout the Solomon Islands. Occasionally, information arrived with remarkable precision. More often, however, success depended on patience, observation, and the instincts developed through repeated patrols. By mid-July, PT boats still occupied a strange place within the Navy. They were widely discussed among those serving in the Pacific, yet relatively little was known about them outside operational circles. Official reports often referred to them only in general terms, emphasizing small naval craft rather than identifying them specifically. Their reputation grew through rumor and speculation. Reports describing sudden nighttime encounters circulated among both Allied and Japanese forces. Many observers struggled to understand how such small vessels could appear unexpectedly in contested waters and disappear again before a response could be organized. That uncertainty worked in our favor. The less our opponents understood about how we operated, the greater our chances of success. And by the middle of July 1943, after weeks of learning, adapting, and refining our methods, our squadron was finally ready for the mission that would test everything we had learned in the Solomon Islands. The uncertainty surrounding our operations gave us an advantage that could not be measured on any chart. For weeks, reports had circulated about mysterious nighttime attacks in the Solomon Islands. Enemy commanders knew something was interfering with their movements, but many still underestimated the threat posed by a handful of small patrol boats operating under cover of darkness. In mid-July, intelligence sources began reporting increased maritime activity moving through the Central Solomons. Observers stationed on remote islands tracked a significant convoy preparing to transit one of the narrow channels leading toward Japanese positions on Kolombangara. The information immediately captured everyone's attention. This was exactly the kind of target our squadron had been preparing for. Several large transports appeared to be moving through restricted waters where maneuverability would be limited. Geography would reduce many of the advantages normally enjoyed by larger formations. If conditions remained favorable, a small force might have an opportunity to disrupt the movement. Lieutenant Commander McPherson volunteered our boat for the operation. 2 additional PT boats would accompany us, each commanded by experienced officers who had already completed numerous patrols throughout the region. Together we formed a compact strike group tasked with intercepting the convoy before it reached its destination. The briefing that evening drew a larger crowd than usual. Maps covered the tables. Navigation routes were reviewed repeatedly. Intelligence officers summarized everything they knew about the approaching ships and their escorting vessels. No one underestimated the challenge. The convoy was expected to be heavily protected, and any mistake would leave our small boats exposed in confined waters far from assistance. Before dismissing us, the squadron commander delivered a simple message. The mission mattered. Enemy reinforcements reaching the front could influence ongoing operations throughout the islands. Preventing that movement was worth every effort we could reasonably make. As daylight faded, the sky above the Solomons transformed into a mixture of deep red and purple. The tropical heat lingered even after sunset. Aboard PT-164, preparations began hours before departure. Patrick O'Brien inspected equipment repeatedly, reviewing every detail with the same meticulous attention he brought to every mission. Carlos Mendoza moved between the engine compartments, listening carefully as the Packards settled into their familiar rhythm. Nearby, Dutch Vanderberg studied charts under dim lighting. He checked headings, distances, currents, and estimated transit times. Numbers seemed to come naturally to him, and nobody questioned his calculations. The rest of us focused on our own responsibilities. I inspected my weapons station, checked ammunition feeds, and verified that every mechanism operated smoothly. Around the boat, crewmen moved quietly through rehearsed routines developed over months of training and patrol experience. Nobody wasted words. By then, everyone understood the importance of preparation. As darkness settled across the islands, we cast off and eased away from the dock. The 3 PT boats traveled in formation through the growing night. Engine noise remained low as we moved away from Rendova and into open water. The sea conditions were less than ideal. Moderate waves rolled across the channel, causing each boat to rise and fall steadily. The rough surface complicated navigation and timing, yet it also provided concealment. Choppy water made it more difficult for distant observers to identify wakes or track movement. In our line of work, even small advantages mattered. Hour after hour we advanced through the darkness. Island silhouettes appeared and disappeared along the horizon. Above us, scattered clouds drifted across the moon, alternately revealing and concealing the surrounding waters. Shortly before midnight, we reached the designated waiting area near the northern coast of Vella La Vella. McPherson ordered reduced speed. Gradually, the engine settled into a near whisper, and the boat drifted quietly among the waves. The atmosphere changed immediately. Every conversation ceased. Every crewman focused on the darkness ahead. The sounds around us became remarkably clear. Water brushed against the hull. Wind moved through distant trees. Somewhere far away, artillery continued its relentless work on New Georgia. Time seemed to slow. Minutes passed with agonizing patience. Then a message arrived from one of the observation networks monitoring enemy movements. The report indicated multiple large vessels approaching our sector. The convoy was finally within range. At once, the mood aboard PT-164 shifted from waiting to action. Engines were brought up carefully. Navigation lights remained dark. Every crewman moved to his assigned position. Months of training, weeks of patrols, and countless lessons learned in the Solomon Islands had led to this moment. The calculations were straightforward. The execution would be anything but. Somewhere beyond the darkness, ships were moving steadily toward their destination, unaware that 3 small PT boats were already maneuvering into position. The hunt had begun. The convoy maintained a steady speed as it moved through the channel. Dutch quickly estimated their course and timing. Our boats could move considerably faster if necessary, which meant we had a narrow window to position ourselves ahead of their route. If everything worked according to plan, we would meet them in the tightest section of Blackett Strait, where changing course would be difficult. Shortly after midnight, on July 20th, Dutch finally spotted the formation through his binoculars. Dark silhouettes emerged against the faint glow of the night sky, exactly where intelligence had predicted. Once our eyes adjusted, the convoy became surprisingly easy to follow. The formation was disciplined and orderly. Escort vessels led the column, while several large transports followed behind. Another escort vessel trailed the formation. No navigation lights were visible, yet their spacing and movement revealed their position. McPherson's plan was simple in theory and extremely risky in practice. One PT boat would approach from the left flank. Another would move in from the opposite side. Our boat would advance through the center, slipping between the escorting ships and positioning for the clearest possible approach. It was the kind of maneuver that left little room for error. The order came quietly: reduce speed. We eased forward, barely disturbing the water, allowing the convoy to continue toward us. The distance closed steadily. Soon we could hear the low vibration of engines carrying large ships through the channel. A little closer and individual outlines became visible: bridge structures, cargo equipment, crewmen moving across decks. Everyone aboard PT-164 remained focused on his task. Then came the signal. A brief transmission passed between the boats. Within seconds, all three PT boats accelerated simultaneously. The quiet darkness vanished beneath the roar of engines as our small craft surged forward. The bow lifted slightly, and spray raced past both sides of the hull. Months of preparation had led to this moment. The convoy's crews appeared surprised by the sudden appearance of fast-moving boats emerging from the darkness at close range. For a few precious seconds, confusion worked in our favor. Our formation pressed ahead. I began firing short, controlled bursts toward selected points on the nearest escort vessel, while the rest of the crew focused on navigation and timing. The boat vibrated beneath my feet as we raced through the channel. At the designated range, our torpedoes were launched. The weapons entered the water and sped toward their targets. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Every eye followed their path through the darkness. Then bright flashes appeared farther ahead as impacts struck among the convoy. The night sky lit up with sudden bursts of light. Large plumes of water and smoke rose into the air. The orderly formation immediately began to break apart as ships attempted to respond to the unexpected attack. Searchlights swept across the channel. Moments later, one of the beams locked onto our position. The intense light transformed darkness into daylight and instantly revealed our location. Defensive fire followed, splashing into the water around us as we maneuvered at high speed through the channel. Spray drenched the deck. Engines thundered. Orders and warnings echoed across the boat. Ahead of us, more flashes illuminated the horizon as the other PT boats carried out their attacks. One transport was rocked by a powerful detonation. Another became surrounded by fire and smoke as confusion spread throughout the convoy. For several moments, the entire channel seemed filled with moving lights, engine noise, and the chaos that follows any surprise engagement. Yet, amid all the noise, McPherson remained calm. His focus never changed. We had achieved the most important objective. The convoy had been caught off guard. Now the challenge was escaping before the larger ships could organize an effective response. The most dangerous part of the mission was only beginning. The convoy was no longer caught by surprise. Bright flashes and burning wreckage illuminated sections of the channel, turning what had been our greatest advantage into a growing danger. Small pieces of debris drifted through the air and landed across the deck. Crewmen rushed to clear them away while maintaining their stations. The enemy escorts reacted quickly. Unable to bring all of their heavier weapons to bear effectively at such close range, they relied on speed and aggressive maneuvering. One of the destroyers altered course sharply and headed directly toward our position. For a brief moment, it appeared as though the much larger ship intended to force us aside through sheer size. McPherson responded instantly. The wheels spun hard over and the engines roared as PT-164 changed direction with remarkable agility. The boat leaned sharply and skipped across the water, avoiding the approaching vessel by what felt like only a few yards. The maneuver left everyone breathless. There was no time to celebrate. Searchlights now swept continuously across the strait, turning darkness into moving patches of blinding white light. Every minute that passed made escape more difficult. Nearby, PT-171 encountered serious trouble while attempting to complete its approach. Enemy fire forced the boat to break off its run before achieving its intended position. Damage to the bow reduced its effectiveness and left the crew fighting to keep the vessel operational. Even so, they managed to remain underway. That alone was a remarkable achievement under the circumstances. By now, the entire convoy was fully alert. The confusion that had protected us during the opening moments of the attack had disappeared. Searchlights crossed back and forth over the water, while defensive fire came from multiple directions. Columns of spray erupted around us. The sea seemed alive with movement. Larger escort ships had finally begun coordinating their response, and every second we remained in the area increased the risk dramatically. McPherson understood the situation immediately. The mission had already achieved its primary objective. Remaining longer offered little benefit and enormous danger. The order came without hesitation. Complete the attack and withdraw. Our crew carried out the command while the boat maneuvered at high speed through the increasingly chaotic waters. Additional torpedoes were launched toward the remaining ships in the convoy, but the enemy had become far more alert and was actively taking evasive action. The opportunity for surprise had passed. Now survival became the priority. With engines operating at maximum output, PT-164 accelerated away from the engagement area. We weaved through darkness, changing course repeatedly while putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and the convoy. Behind us, flashes continued to illuminate the horizon. The battle's final moments unfolded far enough away that details became difficult to distinguish. We could only see bursts of light reflecting off clouds and water as the convoy struggled to reorganize itself. Several miles south of the engagement area, the surviving PT boats gradually reunited. One by one, dark silhouettes emerged from the night. The sight brought enormous relief. Every crew knew that not all missions ended with a successful rendezvous. PT-171 arrived carrying significant damage. Several compartments had taken on water, and one engine was no longer functioning. Crewmen immediately began emergency repairs, while wounded sailors received treatment from the medical personnel available aboard the small boats. PT-168 had also suffered damage during the action. Communications equipment had been affected, and portions of the superstructure showed clear signs of the battle, yet the boat remained operational. Compared with the others, PT-164 had been fortunate. We discovered scattered shrapnel damage, scorched sections along the deck, and equipment that would require repair before our next patrol. Considering the intensity of the engagement, the results could have been far worse. As the adrenaline slowly faded, exhaustion began to set in. No one spoke much. Most of us simply sat where we could, listening to the engines and watching the darkness around us. The mission had tested every lesson we had learned since arriving in the Solomon Islands. Speed, coordination, surprise, discipline under pressure. Those principles had carried us through the night. For the first time since joining the PT service, many of us realized that the concept behind these small wooden boats truly worked. We were not designed to overpower larger warships. We were designed to exploit opportunities they could not. That night, despite the damage and the close calls, 3 small PT boats had challenged a much larger force and lived to tell the story. As dawn approached over the Solomon Sea, we turned our bows toward Rendova, tired, battered, and grateful to still be afloat. By the time the engagement ended, the results were becoming clear. Several transports had been taken out of action, and the convoy's mission had been disrupted. Just as important, the remaining ships abandoned their original course and withdrew rather than continue toward their destination. For us, however, the mission was far from over. Getting home often proved just as dangerous as the attack itself. With daylight approaching, enemy reconnaissance aircraft began searching the surrounding waters. Our boats lacked the protection to challenge aircraft in open water, so concealment became our primary defense. Throughout the morning, we moved cautiously between small islands, using coastlines and vegetation for cover whenever possible. At times, the engines remained silent while we drifted in sheltered areas, listening to aircraft pass overhead. Every crewman understood the importance of remaining unseen. What should have been a relatively short trip turned into a long and exhausting journey. Hour after hour, we advanced carefully toward Rendova, avoiding unnecessary risks and waiting for opportunities to move safely. By the time the base finally came into view, everyone aboard was physically drained. Still, we had all returned. That alone was reason for gratitude. The debriefing began almost immediately. Intelligence officers wanted every detail we could remember. They asked about enemy formations, escort patterns, reaction times, communication methods, and navigation routes. Nothing was considered too small to record. The information gathered from a single patrol might influence future operations throughout the Pacific. We answered questions for hours. At the time, few of us realized how important those reports would become. As intelligence analysts reviewed information from multiple patrols, a larger picture emerged. Enemy commanders were beginning to acknowledge a new challenge operating in the Solomon Islands. The sudden appearance of fast patrol boats in unexpected locations created uncertainty throughout key shipping routes. For months, many Japanese naval units had operated after dark with considerable confidence. Now that confidence was being challenged. Night was no longer predictable. Routes that once seemed relatively secure required additional caution. Convoys needed larger escorts. Movement schedules became more complicated. Commanders devoted increasing resources to protection and reconnaissance. Over time, those adjustments carried consequences. Additional escorts meant fewer ships available for other missions. More reconnaissance flights required more fuel, personnel, and planning. Supply movements became slower and more complicated. Each small delay created opportunities for Allied forces. The psychological effect was equally important. War is influenced not only by equipment and numbers, but also by confidence. Once uncertainty enters the equation, every decision becomes more difficult. By late 1943, PT boats had established a reputation far beyond their size. Squadrons operating throughout the Pacific continued refining tactics and sharing lessons learned. New bases appeared across expanding operational areas. Improved equipment entered service. Better engines, more advanced electronics, and enhanced defensive features increased effectiveness. Many of the methods developed during those early Solomon Islands operations became standard training for future crews. Yet success always carried a price. The Pacific campaign remained unforgiving. Some of the men who shared meals, patrols, and long nights with us never had the opportunity to return home. Boats were lost. Crews disappeared during routine operations. Mechanical failures, mines, aircraft, and enemy action remained constant threats. Every empty bunk served as a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change. As the months passed, our squadron continued operating despite those losses. New crews arrived. Replacement boats filled vacant berths along the docks. Missions continued because the larger campaign demanded it. By the autumn of 1943, I received orders returning me to the United States for training connected with newer PT boat construction and operations. Leaving the Solomons felt strange. The islands had become a world of their own, a place defined by humid nights, hidden channels, sudden danger, and friendships forged under extraordinary circumstances. When I finally departed, our squadron's record reflected months of relentless operations across some of the most challenging waters in the Pacific. But statistics never captured the full story. What I remembered most were the faces of the men who served beside me, the mechanics who kept impossible machines running, the radio operators listening through endless static, the gunners scanning dark horizons for signs of movement. Those men transformed a collection of wooden boats into an effective fighting force. A few months later, in March 1944, I returned to the Pacific once again. This time, I would serve aboard a different PT boat, operating in the Philippines, carrying with me the lessons learned in the Solomon Islands and the memories of a campaign that had changed naval warfare forever. As the war progressed, the boats continued to evolve. New models arrived with improved radar, stronger protection for critical areas, and equipment that crews trusted far more than the systems we had carried during those early Solomon Islands patrols. Technology improved year after year, but the principles that guided us never changed. Speed remained our advantage. Surprise remained our shield. Boldness remained our greatest asset. No matter how advanced the equipment became, success still depended on the men operating it. The enemy adapted as best they could. Additional patrols appeared in contested waters. New detection methods were introduced. Convoys received heavier protection, and commanders experimented with different defensive tactics. Yet the challenge never fully disappeared. The Pacific Ocean was simply too vast. There were too many islands, too many channels, and too many routes to protect every movement at all times. Small patrol craft continued finding opportunities where larger forces could not. Looking back now, I believe that uncertainty became one of the PT boat's greatest contributions. Enemy commanders could never be entirely certain what waited beyond the next island or around the next bend in a channel. Every nighttime movement required greater caution than before. That alone changed the character of operations throughout large sections of the Pacific. After the war, the members of our crew followed very different paths. McPherson remained in naval service and continued building an impressive career. We exchanged letters for decades. At a memorial service many years later, his family shared stories of how often he spoke about the lessons learned aboard those small boats. He believed courage was not the absence of fear. It was the ability to continue moving forward despite it. Dutch Vanderberg returned to academic life. The navigation skills and ocean knowledge he refined during wartime eventually contributed to a distinguished scientific career. Whenever we met, he liked to joke that navigating crowded wartime waters made every civilian challenge seem simple by comparison. Carlos Mendoza returned to California and resumed working with high-performance engines. The same creativity that kept our PT boats operating under difficult conditions helped him build a respected reputation in the automotive world. Patrick O'Brien remained closely connected to naval technology for many years. His expertise became widely recognized, and he devoted much of his post-war life to improving maintenance standards and training programs. Like many veterans, he never forgot the boats or the men who served aboard them. Neither did the rest of us. When people discuss the Pacific War, attention naturally focuses on the largest campaigns and most famous battles. Massive fleets, aircraft carriers, and major invasions dominate the history books. The PT boat story occupies a smaller chapter. Yet for those of us who lived it, the experience represented something important. We witnessed how innovation could challenge assumptions. We learned that effectiveness was not always determined by size. We saw how adaptability often mattered more than tradition. The boats themselves were remarkable machines, but machinery alone never explains success. Equipment can create opportunities. People decide what to do with them. What made the PT boat program successful was the willingness of crews, engineers, and commanders to embrace new ideas when older methods proved inadequate. That lesson remains relevant long after the war ended. Modern naval forces operate in ways that would have seemed unimaginable in 1943. Technology has transformed nearly every aspect of maritime operations, yet many of the underlying concepts remain familiar. Mobility, stealth, flexibility, the ability to appear where least expected and act before an opponent can respond. Those ideas were central to our missions in the Solomon Islands, and they continue to influence naval thinking today. Whenever I read about modern fast attack craft or innovative maritime tactics, I am reminded of those nights aboard PT-164. I remember the darkness. I remember the tension before an operation. I remember the men who shared that small wooden deck and trusted one another completely. Most of all, I remember a time when a handful of determined sailors, operating from fragile wooden boats, demonstrated that imagination could be just as powerful as firepower. That, more than any individual mission or statistic, is the legacy I carried with me from the Pacific. The boats are long gone now. The war belongs to history. But the lessons learned in those dark waters continue to endure, carried forward by every generation that believes new ideas can overcome old limitations, and that courage often comes in the most unexpected forms. Years after the war ended, historians and former naval officers on both sides began comparing records and sharing their experiences. One theme appeared again and again. The influence of PT boats extended far beyond their actual numbers. Enemy commanders often faced a difficult problem. They rarely knew exactly where PT boats were operating, which meant they had to prepare for the possibility that they might be anywhere. Convoys required additional precautions. Routes were altered. Escorts were reassigned. Valuable time and resources were devoted to guarding against threats that often existed only as possibilities. In many ways, uncertainty became one of our most effective weapons. Several former Japanese naval officers later described the psychological strain created by constant nighttime patrols. Large warships could be tracked and studied. Aircraft followed predictable patterns. Small patrol boats operating in darkness were something else entirely. They appeared unexpectedly. They disappeared just as quickly. Even when no PT boats were present, crews often had to assume they might be nearby. That constant vigilance took a toll. Looking back, I believe that psychological pressure mattered as much as any individual operation. War is not only a contest of equipment and logistics, it is also a test of confidence. Once doubt begins to spread, every decision becomes more complicated. The development of PT boats throughout the war reflected that lesson. The early vessels were built quickly, during a period when nobody knew exactly how they would be used. They entered combat carrying equipment that often required improvement and operating procedures that were still evolving. By the final years of the war, the boats looked very different. Radar systems became more capable. Navigation equipment improved. Additional weapons and defensive measures expanded their flexibility. Engineers constantly searched for ways to increase effectiveness while preserving the qualities that made PT boats unique. Yet, despite all those improvements, the foundation remained unchanged. The boats were still small. They were still fast. They still depended on initiative and creativity rather than overwhelming force. And most importantly, they still relied on volunteers willing to operate in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. One of the most remarkable aspects of the PT boat story was the willingness of crews to accept missions that appeared impossible on paper. Again and again, small boats found themselves operating near forces that dwarfed them in size and firepower. Their objective was rarely to overpower an opponent. Instead, it was to create opportunities, disrupt plans, gather information, or buy precious time for larger operations elsewhere. Many successes were never measured in ships or statistics. Sometimes success meant forcing an enemy commander to delay a movement. Sometimes it meant drawing attention away from a more important target. Sometimes it simply meant surviving another night and returning with valuable intelligence. Those achievements rarely made headlines, yet they often influenced events far beyond the horizon. The places where PT crews lived became legendary in their own way. Rendova, Tulagi, Mioswawende, and countless other remote bases were a world apart from major naval installations. Conditions were primitive. Tropical heat, insects, mud, and isolation became part of daily life. Most comforts disappeared quickly. Mail arrived when it could. Supplies arrived when available. Entertainment was limited to conversations, card games, and stories exchanged between patrols. Yet morale remained surprisingly strong. The reason was simple. Everyone believed their work mattered. No discussion of the Solomon Islands campaign would be complete without recognizing the extraordinary assistance provided by local island communities. Their knowledge of the region was invaluable. They understood coastlines, reefs, currents, and jungle trails better than any map ever could. Many willingly shared information, assisted stranded servicemen, and helped maintain communication networks across vast distances. Their contributions rarely appeared in official headlines, but countless Allied operations benefited from their courage and dedication. The same was true for the coast watchers scattered across remote islands. These observers worked in isolation under extremely difficult conditions. Equipped with little more than radios, binoculars, and determination, they monitored enormous stretches of ocean and reported what they saw. Many warnings arrived just in time. A message about approaching aircraft, a report concerning ship movements, an observation that helped commanders make better decisions. Those pieces of information often proved invaluable. Most PT crews never met the people sending those reports, yet we understood how much we depended upon them. As the war continued, another innovation transformed our operations more than almost anything else: radar. The earliest sets were crude by modern standards. Operators spent countless hours learning how to interpret confusing signals and imperfect displays. Sometimes distinguishing between land, weather, and ships required as much experience as technology. Even so, radar gradually changed the way we operated. For the first time, crews gained a tool that could extend their awareness beyond what human eyes could see in darkness. And for sailors who had built their reputation operating in the night, that advantage would prove invaluable in the final years of the Pacific campaign. As radar technology improved during the final years of the war, nighttime operations changed dramatically. The early systems had been difficult to trust. Signals were often confusing and required experienced operators to interpret correctly. Yet with each new generation, the equipment became more reliable. By late 1944, radar allowed crews to identify potential contacts in conditions that would have been impossible only a year earlier. Darkness, rain, and fog no longer provided the same level of concealment they once had. For sailors who spent their lives operating after sunset, that shift was significant. The advantage in night operations increasingly belonged to the side that could gather information first and act upon it fastest. At the same time, our tactics continued evolving. Nothing remained static for long in the Pacific. Crews constantly exchanged ideas and lessons learned from patrols. New methods were tested, refined, and shared across squadrons. Some techniques improved coordination between multiple boats. Others focused on deception, navigation, or communication. The goal was always the same: increase effectiveness while reducing risk. Experience taught us that flexibility mattered more than rigid doctrine. Every island chain presented different challenges. Every mission required adjustments. Many of the most important operations never appeared in newspaper headlines. People naturally remember dramatic naval engagements, but much of our work involved supporting other units throughout the Pacific. We transported personnel to remote locations. We carried supplies to isolated positions. We assisted with reconnaissance missions and emergency evacuations. We delivered equipment where larger vessels could not safely operate. Those assignments rarely attracted attention, yet they often proved essential to larger campaigns. Over time, PT boats became known for their versatility. If a mission required speed, improvisation, and a willingness to operate under difficult conditions, chances were good that a PT crew would be involved. Life aboard a PT boat created relationships unlike anything I experienced elsewhere in the Navy. Large ships offered anonymity. Small boats did not. With only a handful of men sharing limited space day after day, Everyone learned each other's habits, strengths, and weaknesses. You knew who remained calm under pressure. You knew who could solve mechanical problems in the dark. You knew who would always be there when things became difficult. Trust developed naturally because it had to. The boat depended on every member of the crew doing his job. Those friendships survived long after the war ended. Years later, when veterans gathered for reunions, the atmosphere felt less like a military event and more like a family gathering. Shared experiences had created bonds that time could not erase. Daily life was far less glamorous than people imagined. Food was basic and often repetitive. Fresh supplies arrived irregularly, particularly at remote bases. Drinking water had to be conserved carefully. Comfort ranked low on the list of priorities. Most of our energy went toward keeping the boats operational. Maintenance consumed an astonishing amount of time. Salt water attacked every exposed surface. Tropical heat damaged equipment. Constant high-speed operations placed tremendous stress on engines and mechanical systems. Every patrol generated another list of repairs. Every successful mission depended on the countless hours spent maintaining equipment afterward. No crew could afford to ignore those responsibilities. A mechanical failure at the wrong moment could leave a boat stranded far from help. Because of that, maintenance became almost a culture of its own. Every sailor learned skills that extended far beyond his official specialty. The environment itself remained a constant challenge. Weather in the Solomon Islands could change without warning. Calm seas could become rough within minutes. Heavy rain reduced visibility and complicated navigation. The heat seemed endless. Humidity soaked clothing and equipment alike. Yet the same conditions that challenged us often provided protection. Storms reduced visibility for enemy aircraft. Rough seas concealed movement. Clouds and rain helped disguise small boats operating close to shore. We learned to work with nature rather than fight against it. Navigation demanded equal adaptability. Many charts available at the time contained incomplete information. Coastlines, reefs, and channels did not always match what appeared on paper. As a result, experience became invaluable. Crews learned to recognize subtle changes in watercolor. They observed wave patterns and currents. They studied coastlines until individual islands became familiar landmarks. Sometimes, local knowledge proved more reliable than official maps. Every patrol expanded our understanding of the region. Every safe return added another piece to a constantly growing mental picture of the Pacific. Meanwhile, our opponents continued searching for ways to counter the PT boat threat. They adjusted convoy procedures. They improved patrol patterns. They experimented with new methods for detecting and tracking small craft operating after dark. The contest became one of adaptation. Each side learned from experience and responded to the other's innovations. That ongoing struggle shaped much of the Pacific campaign. For the men serving aboard PT boats, it reinforced a lesson we had learned years earlier in the Solomon Islands. Success did not belong to the strongest force. More often, it belonged to the side that could learn, adapt, and innovate faster than its opponent. And that lesson would remain just as important as any weapon carried aboard our boats. As the war continued, the contest between innovation and adaptation never stopped. Every time one side introduced a new tactic, the other searched for a response. New technologies appeared. New procedures were tested. New ideas spread from squadron to squadron across the Pacific. For those of us serving aboard PT boats, it often felt like an endless game of strategy played in darkness, where success depended on staying one step ahead. The physical dangers were obvious. The emotional burden was harder to describe. Living with uncertainty became part of daily life. Every patrol carried risks. Every departure from the dock came with the understanding that there were no guarantees of return. We lost friends. We watched talented sailors disappear from the roster, and never come back. Each crew found its own way of dealing with that reality. Some men chose quieter assignments when the opportunity came. Others threw themselves into their work with even greater intensity. Most simply continued forward, one mission at a time, relying on routine, friendship, and determination. Humor became one of our most effective survival tools. The jokes were often ridiculous. Nicknames appeared for everything. Boats received colorful personalities of their own. Crews decorated equipment, invented traditions, and created stories that grew more exaggerated with every retelling. It may have seemed strange to outsiders. To us, it was a way of preserving normalcy in an environment where very little was normal. Those moments of laughter mattered more than people realize. The influence of PT boats eventually reached far beyond the Pacific. Lessons learned in the Solomon Islands and the Philippines found their way into operations in other theaters. Naval planners studied what worked and what failed. The experience gained by small boat crews contributed to broader discussions about mobility, coastal operations, reconnaissance, and rapid response missions. The boats themselves represented something larger than their size. They demonstrated that creative thinking could expand the options available to commanders. They showed that smaller platforms, properly employed, could make meaningful contributions alongside larger and more heavily armed vessels. Looking back across the decades, what amazes me most is not what we accomplished, but how young we were when we did it. Many of us had entered the war with limited experience and only a vague understanding of what lay ahead. Yet circumstances demanded that we learn quickly. We made mistakes. We learned from them. We adapted. That process transformed ordinary sailors into experienced crews capable of operating in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The true achievement of the PT boat program was not a particular mission or a specific engagement. It was proving that an unconventional idea could succeed when combined with determination, training, and teamwork. That lesson remains relevant long after the war itself faded into history. Modern naval forces employ technologies we could never have imagined in 1943. Yet many of the principles remain familiar. Speed, flexibility, initiative, the ability to respond faster than an opponent expects. Whenever I read about modern patrol craft, special operations vessels, or advanced maritime systems, I recognize traces of the same philosophy that guided us so many years ago. The equipment has changed, the oceans have not. Neither has the importance of adaptability. When people ask whether I am proud of my service, I do not think first about medals or official records. I remember the men. I remember long nights at sea, engines humming beneath our feet, watching distant islands drift past beneath the stars. I remember crews working together under difficult conditions, trusting one another completely. I remember the feeling that even small actions could contribute to something larger than ourselves. The PT boats were never the biggest ships in the Pacific. They were never the most powerful. They were not intended to be. Their strength came from the people who served aboard them, and from a willingness to try something different when traditional solutions were not enough. That is why their story endures. The last wartime PT boats eventually disappeared from active service, replaced by newer generations of vessels built for a changing world. But for those of us who knew them firsthand, they remain unforgettable. Not because they were perfect, not because they were invincible, but because they represented a simple idea that proved remarkably powerful. Given the right people, a bold idea, and the courage to pursue it, even the smallest vessel can leave a lasting mark on history. And that, more than anything else, is what I remember when I think about the PT boats and the young sailors who carried their legacy across the waters of the Pacific. Now, many decades later, I sit quietly in a room filled with memories. Photographs faded by time rest beside old letters and worn newspaper clippings. The faces staring back at me belong to young men who once believed they were indestructible. Some returned home and built long lives. Others remain forever young in those pictures, frozen in a moment history refused to give back. When I close my eyes, the years seem to disappear. I can still hear the deep growl of Packard engines carrying us through the darkness. I can still remember the endless nights beneath tropical skies, the smell of salt air mixed with fuel, the constant vibration of the boat beneath my feet. Certain memories never fade, but what stays with me most is not the danger. It is the people. We arrived as strangers from different corners of America. Some had grown up in cities, others came from farms, fishing towns, or factory neighborhoods. We shared little in common except a uniform and a mission. Yet those small wooden boats transformed us. The challenges we faced demanded trust, responsibility, and resilience. They taught us lessons no classroom could provide. They turned young sailors into experienced professionals and created friendships that endured long after the war ended. When historians write about great naval campaigns, they often focus on fleets, admirals, and major battles. Those stories deserve to be remembered, but the PT boat story was different. It was the story of ordinary people asked to attempt something unconventional. It was a story about adaptation, creativity, and the willingness to embrace new ideas when traditional solutions no longer worked. The boats themselves were never the whole story. Wood, engines, and equipment alone could accomplish nothing. What mattered were the crews who operated them, the mechanics who kept them running, the coast watchers who provided warnings, the islanders who offered assistance, and the countless support personnel who made every mission possible. Together, they demonstrated that innovation often begins with individuals willing to challenge accepted assumptions. That lesson remains as important today as it was during the war. Technology changes, strategies evolve. New generations face different challenges, yet the qualities that matter most remain remarkably consistent. Determination, adaptability, teamwork, the courage to try something new when the outcome is uncertain. Those qualities define the PT boat program from beginning to end. Looking back, I do not believe the legacy of those boats can be measured solely by operations or statistics. Their true legacy lies in what they represented. They proved that smaller forces could make meaningful contributions when used intelligently. They demonstrated the value of initiative and imagination. They reminded military leaders that innovation often comes from unexpected places. Most importantly, they showed what ordinary citizens could accomplish when united by a common purpose. The war eventually ended. The boats disappeared. The bases were reclaimed by jungle and time. But the lessons remained. Every generation inherits them in one form or another. And so, as I reach the end of this account, I find myself grateful. Grateful for the men who served beside me. Grateful for the opportunity to have witnessed a remarkable chapter of history. Grateful that those stories can still be told. The PT boats were never the largest vessels in the Pacific. They were never intended to be. Their importance came from something far greater than size. They represented ingenuity in the face of uncertainty, determination in the face of adversity, and the belief that bold ideas can change the course of events. That is how I choose to remember them, not as weapons, not as machines, but as symbols of a generation that faced extraordinary challenges and answered them with courage, creativity, and an unwavering commitment to one another. And in that sense, their voyage continues long after the last patrol ended and the final wake disappeared into the sea.